So we're going to use the same format today as in the previous seminars, which is that Professor Hussain will give us the scientific perspective. Then I'll open the floor to any specific questions you'd like to ask to Professor Hussain for a brief period, then hand over to Ben Morgan from the humanities. And again, after his talk, offer the chance if you want to ask any specific questions to Ben. After that, we will head over to the drinks in the corner for a short break, after which we will open a general discussion. So, our first speaker today is Professor Masood Hussain. He was Professor of Clinical Neurology at UCL and the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery. And he was the London Deputy Director of the UCL Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience. He is now the holder of a Principal Fellowship by the Wellcome Trust and is Professor of Neurology and Cognitive Neuroscience at Oxford and a Fellow of New College. His research focuses on inattention, disorders of memory, impulsivity and apathy. He's developing techniques to examine attention, short-term or working memory and decision-making in healthy people and in patients with neurological disorders. And in doing so, he's beginning to understand some of the brain mechanisms that are disrupted when people don't pay attention or forget information rapidly, when they make impulsive decisions or can't motivate it to act. And that research is helping to develop treatments for conditions in which phenomena like that become disabling, such as in Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease, or in developmental disorders like ADHD. And today, he's going to talk to us about the neuroscience of unconscious memory. Masood.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you so much for the invitation. It would be fair to say that neuroscience thinks it's got a long way, but I think even the neuroscientists in this room would be agreeing with me when I say that actually we're really at an infancy in our understanding of memory, despite over 100 years worth of work. So without further ado, let me start off by taking you back to 1911. And we're going to make the acquaintance of Edouard Claparède, who's a Swiss neurologist. He's been trained at the Salpêtrière. He's been at the feet of Charcot, who's thought to be the founder of European neurology. And he's now had the fortune to meet a woman who seems to be deeply amnesic. He sees her every day, but she has no recollection of meeting him. Every day, it's a new introduction to the doctor. So he begins to wonder whether there is anything in her memory that might survive the injury that she's had. So one day, when he goes to shake her hand, he has a pin in his hand. This is that pin. And when he shakes her hand, he pricks her skin. She's a little bit surprised, but brushes it off. He apologizes, and that's all there is to it. But the next day, when he sees her again, she also doesn't recognize him. He goes to shake her hand, but at that moment, she withdraws it. Subconsciously, somehow, she has registered that this is not a hand you want to touch. And probably, this is one of the first bits of evidence that priming can occur in individuals who are deeply amnesic. They have no conscious awareness of meeting this doctor, and yet they know there's something wrong about shaking his hand. And that kind of work really has led to this general scheme about the fractionation of long-term memory. This is not about short-term or working memory. And long-term memory has been thought of, if you like, to consist of explicit memory, that's with conscious recall, or implicit memory, without conscious recall. And even within the explicit memory system, there appears to be fractionation. There is what we would refer to as episodic memory, recollection for what you did yesterday, with whom, at what time, where, putting all those bits of information together. And there's also semantic memory, the understanding of facts, bits of knowledge. You know Paris is the capital of France. You know that a few weeks ago there was very unusual events that occurred there. You know all those facts, and this is thought to be semantic memory. And finally, in the implicit memory section, we have things that go under the name of procedural memory, how you learn to ride a bike, drive a car, that kind of thing, which I'm not going to deal with today. What I am going to deal with today is to focus on this issue about priming, which, as Simon mentioned, is enhanced identification in some way of objects or words, or in fact any other kind of material you might have seen previously, and that somehow facilitates your response to that item. So in the modern era, we haven't used pins to look at priming in amnesia, but these kinds of stimuli instead. Now, I don't know if you can make out anything here. These are fragmented stimuli. Probably not at the moment. If I make them less fragmented, some of you may be starting to make guesses about what these things are. Yes? And then if you go all the way, it becomes very evident what these stimuli are. And these kind of stimuli have been used a lot in research in amnesia, pioneered really by Elizabeth Warrington and Larry Weisskranz. Weisskranz was the professor of psychology at Oxford. Warrington was a neuropsychologist, she's still a neuropsychologist at the National Hospital for Neurology, Queen's Square. And they did a series of pioneering experiments actually in a number of brain syndromes, but particularly in memory. Now, I've taken the original figures here from their publications in 1970. So just concentrate on the dotted line for a minute. What they're showing here is that if I repeatedly expose you to stimuli like this, with other types of stimuli as well, you become better and better at identifying what that is. That's a plane. You don't have to go to the more fully fledged, less fragmented form to recognize this is a plane. And with time, only a few trials actually, we get very, very good, such that we don't make any errors at all in identifying what this item is. And what Elizabeth Warrington and Larry Weisskranz found was that actually, rather surprisingly, individuals who are deeply amnesic, shown in the solid line here, have a very similar time course of learning. They can learn this material even though they have no conscious recall of seeing these objects. Okay? They learn them very, very quickly. And an hour later, when we're exposed to such material, we still show a learning benefit. We don't have to see quite the fully fledged one, we can see a fragmented one to recognize what it is. And interestingly, the amnesic patients are also capable of doing this. So they've retained this material over a delay of 1 hour, even though they cannot consciously recall having seen these items. In fact, they went on to do this heroic experiment. They waited 72 hours, they waited 3 days between the learning period and retesting, and found that these amnesic patients still benefited from having been exposed to these fragmented stimuli previously. Okay? So something is still retained in amnesic patients, something we saw primitive in the way of the pin with the patient that Edouard Clapin saw, and now we're also seeing this in these fragmented figures. And in their pioneering series of experiments, Warrington and Weisskranz also went on to look at a few other ways of studying this. They used fragmented words. So what we're doing here is plotting free recall. How many words can you remember from the list that you saw? And even healthy people, the controls, have some difficulty in remembering. But as you might imagine, the amnesic individuals are very severely affected. With recognition, in other words, did you see this item before or not? So yes, no recognition. Actually, we are boosted by that kind of test. So are the amnesics, but there's still a discrepancy. However, if you test them just simply on showing the fragmented words, you find that actually they benefited hugely, comparably to healthy individuals in terms of their memory for those words. So again, an interesting dissociation between when you're directly asked, can you remember something, and when you're shown this sort of fragmented material, which presumably has cued some system in your brain to being able to recognize this word much more easily at the most fragmented level. And they also did this with something called word stem completion, which became a very important way to study cued recall, if you like. So this is a very similar kind of experiment to the one I've just shown previously. Now there are three conditions. So in this case, they got their amnesic and healthy people to learn 5-letter words, and then they tested their memory either with free recall, just tell me which words you remember, or a yes-no recognition task, is this one of the words you saw previously or not, or the word stem completion task. So in this case you might get the letter CHA, and if you'd seen that word before, you might more likely say chair rather than say charm. Okay? And when they did this, they again found a similar kind of result, that when individuals were simply asked to remember or recall what items they saw, the amnesic patients were severely affected. Similarly for recognition, yes or no. But on word completion, with this prompt, if you like, they were just as good as healthy individuals. Okay, so this is the kind of evidence that has led to the idea that our memories are not just one monolithic thing, that they are in fact fractionated. And indeed, as I've shown you here, episodic memory can be severely affected with priming of this kind, either in terms of the fragmented figures or in terms of word completion being relatively preserved. And the credibility of this kind of fractionation has really been established further by anatomical distinctions between these memory systems. So it's now widely accepted, I think, that the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe memory system is really very important for episodic memory. Some would argue for that conscious recall of items from the past, although that's debated whether it needs to be really conscious or not. And what we're talking about, just to give you a grounding in terms of the anatomy, is this is a section through the brain like this. So this is the top, this is the bottom, this is the side, and we're talking about this structure here right in the depth of the brain, and we can image that now with MRI, and what we're talking about is this, the hippocampus. Now, focal damage to the hippocampus is relatively rare, it does occur, but of course in the current era, the disease that's really important in terms of damage to episodic memory and the hippocampus is Alzheimer's disease. In Alzheimer's disease, eventually much of the brain degenerates, but it's interesting that one of the earlier areas which takes the biggest hit is the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe system. So the episodic memory system can be damaged in patients with amnesia, but they still retain this priming from the visual material I've shown you previously. What about the converse? In neuroscience, one of the most interesting things is if you can show what's called a double dissociation. So in this case, we have one group of individuals who have episodic memory impaired, but this kind of priming intact. is there the converse available in a different kind of group of individuals? And it turns out that there is. This is a single unusual case, and what we're showing you here is in the early days of MRI scanning. So here are the eyes, this is the right side of the brain, this is the left side of the brain, and this individual has had the occipital lobe resected because they had intractable epilepsy, which was not amenable to treatment with medication. In this patient, MS, recognition was just as good as in control individuals. So their episodic memory system was intact, unlike the amnesic patients who were also tested in this study. So we know that already. Amnesic patients are going to be bad at this kind of recognition task. But what was interesting here is that they also looked at the word stem completion task I mentioned before. And here are controls. Let's just look only at the unhatched bars here. And the healthy people could do this task very well. They could use those word stems to complete the rest of the word and performed really well in terms of recalling what words they'd seen previously. And so too did the amnesic patients, just as I showed you in the Warrington and Weisskranz studies. They too could use those word stems. The word stems primed them so that they could finish off the rest of the 5-letter word. But interestingly, MS here shows no or very little in the way of facilitation by those word stems. So unlike the amnesic individuals and unlike healthy controls, the word stems did not really help this individual to perform well, although they still had very good recognition memory in terms of was this an item from the list you've seen before or not. So here we have that double dissociation. Some people can have episodic memory damaged, but priming intact, whilst others, like this case here, can have priming apparently not present, but episodic memory intact. Okay. So these are in patients, and they're interesting, unusual, but what about you and me? And the work by Tulving and Schachter and their colleagues has really suggested that priming can occur in healthy people, and they've done various sorts of experiments. I'll show you a few of them just to give you an idea. So they got a group of people to study a series of words. They gave them 96 words, from octopus, climate, avocado, etc. And then they tested their memory either by a yes-no recognition, so they'd give you another list of words, half of which had appeared previously and half of which were completely novel. And then they also tested them with this word fragment completion task. So this is a bit like that word stem completion task. I will help you a little bit by putting in a few of the letters and see whether that prompts you, whether that primes you into correctly identifying the word that you've seen in the previous list. And remember, these are healthy, young individuals. Okay? So these are their data. This is the probability of getting it right, and this is the retention interval here. So this is 1 hour or 7 days. Now let's just do the recognition. So this is simply saying, was this word on the list or not? At 1 hour, they're scoring about 55%. 7 days later, as you might expect, the recognition is poorer. It's nearer the 20% mark. But interestingly, if we look at the word fragment completion study here, these healthy individuals are able to use these prompts just as well at 1 hour and at 7 days. So they're primed by previous encounters, and that priming survives a delay of a whole week, unlike the recognition memory, which is clearly degraded over time, the conscious recognition memory. I'm sure you've worked out this one's octopus. This one, incidentally, is supposed to be bogeyman, but you wouldn't have got that from just seeing this here. Okay, so this stuff is really about taking in words, sensory information. And what's emerged here is that there might be something more than simply perceptual priming, and that's been called conceptual priming. In some ways, it's similar to what one might call semantic priming, understanding meaning. And Schachter and his colleagues did it in this way. They would present sentences like this. The haystack was important because the cloth ripped. And of course, most of us confronted by such sentences would think, what on earth does that mean? Or this one, the notes were sour because the seams split. And we're still thinking, what on earth is that referring to? But if we were given a couple of words, we might make sense of these sentences. In this case, parachute and bagpipe. Try this one. The person was unhappy because the hole was closed, or the hole closed, actually. So apparently that one is pierced ears. Okay. Now, it's unlikely that when you're first confronted, the first time you see those sentences, you'll work out what they're referring to. But what about the second time? So if, after a delay, people were presented with this kind of sentence, you'd find that actually you could make sense of it. You could understand what it referred to because you've seen these cueing words before. Parachute, with the first one, for example. And what Schachter and his team showed was that people who were deeply amnesic nevertheless showed facilitation in solving these kind of sentence problems even after 1 week. So again, they retained the memory of what was associated with this sentence. This sentence made sense, had meaning, when associated with this word. Okay? You could argue about whether this is really completely about concepts, or could it all be explained by perception? But this is the kind of evidence that's been used to suggest that actually priming goes beyond pure perceptual memory. Actually, I thought this was quite a nice little anecdote to tell you. So many of you might know that Sigmund Freud and Wilhelm Fliess had a very sort of tempestuous relationship over the years. And one day, Freud announced to Fliess that he had a momentous new discovery. He'd worked out that all humans were essentially bisexual. And at that moment, Fliess reminded him that he'd actually told Freud that 2 years previously, at which he pooh-poohed him and said, don't be silly. Interestingly, once Freud accepted that, he said, it's painful to have to surrender one's originality in this way. We've all been there. It happens in academia when you think you've come up with the novel idea, but actually you find it's been done 100 years ago by somebody else. And to come more up to date, George Harrison, many of you might know this song, My Sweet Lord, came out with this song in 1971. And it was a big hit. It was the first Beatles hit performed solo, which went to #1. But as soon as it came out, the producers of the Chiffons' He's So Fine, that's really stretching your memory back a little bit, 1962, actually suggested that it sounded very much like their tune. This went to court. It proceeded for 5 years before the judge finally decided that actually George Harrison had performed what he called subconscious plagiarism. And at that point, the damages were more than $500,000, which is quite a lot in the 1970s. I don't think George helped his case by saying that he didn't really take it from He's So Fine. He'd taken it from Oh Happy Day, the gospel song, instead. Interestingly, the title of that album was All Things Must Pass, and in this case, $500,000 did pass because of this. So the question is, can things like this, subconscious plagiarism, really exist? I guess it can. What about in the experimental setting? Is there evidence of unconscious priming? can we be primed by previous encounters that we're not even conscious of? It's possible that George might have been conscious of the Chiffons song. How about if we could control it? Well, one of the most deeply impressive ways of looking at the unconscious state in someone who is conscious, not comatose in any way, is something called the neglect syndrome. Now here is a patient who has this syndrome. So she has a right hemisphere stroke, hence her left arm is paralysed. But I'm asking her here to find some interesting stories in the newspaper. This is the Daily Mail, so it's actually a challenge for all of us. But you can see that all her interest, all her attention is really on the right here, and she is neglecting the left side of space. She doesn't have any pure sensory loss, what we would call a visual field defect. She just simply attends to one side of space. And at its extreme, these kind of patients, if they're asked to copy objects, like this Necker cube, may ignore to fill in the left-hand side, following their right-sided stroke, or if they're asked to copy a flower like this, might do a perfect copy on the right, but ignore elements on the left. This is a nice series of paintings by an Austrian painter who unfortunately suffered one of these kinds of stroke. This is a self-portrait relatively early on after the stroke. You can see that he's neglected the left side of his face and also crammed in his self-portrait on the right-hand side of the sheet of paper. As time progressed, he got better, and you can see more elements of the left coming along, and he did eventually recover from this, so the self-portrait is now much better by the end. But here we have an individual who is not aware that he's missing elements from the left side of space. Okay? And we can also measure this in various different ways. I'll just show you this for interest. So, for example, here is another patient being asked to find the letters C, which are embedded amongst these distractor letters, O's and Q's, on this screen. Every time he finds one, the computer will put a little cross there. While he's doing that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the anatomy of these kinds of syndromes, because they're far more common and far more profound following right hemisphere damage in humans, and they involve either parts of the parietal lobe or the temporoparietal junction, where the parietal lobe meets the temporal lobe, or, interestingly, the inferior parts of the right frontal lobe. It's quite interesting because in most of us, these are homologous areas for zones which look after language in the left hemisphere. So this tends to be very much a right hemisphere syndrome. So I'll let this patient finish. And you can see that he is unaware of many of the items which are on that left-hand side of space. Interestingly, although he is unaware, we can show that his brain is aware. So these are some studies we performed now 15 years ago in UCL. Gerard Rees was the lead investigator here. And we were studying the visual responses in patients like these when they were presented with items, in this case, let's say, a bird on the left and one on the right. And even when they missed this item on the left, one could nevertheless see that the early visual areas in the brain, I should say that the visual pathways from the eyes extend right back to the occipital lobes, and there we have the primary visual cortex. We can see that in primary visual cortex and in surrounding visual areas, there is nevertheless activation when this item is presented, even though the patient has no conscious perception of that item. So this has meant various things, but one of the interesting things is, of course, that just simple activity in these early visual areas does not seem to be sufficient to support conscious perception of information. We might need more than just sensory areas to do this. Now, interestingly, this extends into what one might call unconscious perception in terms of preferences. So this was a study performed by Peter Halligan and John Marshall. In fact, they performed it here in the Radcliffe Infirmary many years ago, in 1988. And what they did was to study patients like this, right hemisphere patients, who had visual neglect. And they would present them with two choices. Here's a house here and one here. Which one would you prefer to live in? Now, if this was a simple chance type of choice, you might say the top one on 50% of the time and the bottom one on the rest of the occasions. But actually, these were their choices. So they chose the bottom one, 80%, and the top one, 20%. And when asked why, they were unable to explain why. They might say something like, well, this looks preferable to me. I think this would be more comfortable. But they wouldn't say the obvious thing, which is actually this one is on fire and I'd rather not live there. Okay, so this is an interesting example of unconscious perception. And to extend this a little bit further, Edoardo Biziac in Italy performed this rather important landmark study. It's gone down in the annals of psychology and neuroscience as a fantastic experiment to perform. Here is the Piazza del Duomo in Milan, and some of you may know that. This is an old postcard I bought 20 years ago or something, but it's a magnificent cathedral. And what Biziac did was to ask his Milanese patients, who knew the city very, very well, to think about the square. So they're not in the square, they're just simply thinking about the square. What he asked them to do was to say, imagine that you're standing at the door of the cathedral and looking back at us. Right? Tell me about the things you remember in that square. And in cartoon form, this is what they recollected. So they might mention the streets going off the square on that right-hand side, or the bookshops, or the cafes, or the restaurants, and they would tend to neglect the items on their left. Remember, this is not in direct vision, this is simply from memory of that square, which they know very well. The very important part of the experiment was the next bit, in which Biziac said, okay, now imagine that you're on the other side of the square. So let's flip your vantage point. You're now going to be looking at the cathedral. Tell me what you remember then. So now they're at the other side of the square and they're looking at the cathedral, right? And they reported, again, streets to the right or shops and restaurants on that right-hand side. But remember, those places were exactly the ones that had been neglected previously from the original vantage point. And now, the things that had been reported from the vantage point of the door of the cathedral were being neglected. So this means that in some way, all that information is really intact. The memory for that square is completely intact, presumably in these individuals. But when it comes to trying to describe, recollect, imagine that square, then it depends on the vantage point at which the square was being viewed. It's almost like an analog screen, cinema screen if you like, and to try and remember it in visual memory, that's what's being done. It's being cast onto this screen, and whatever's on the left of your vantage point is being missed. So that's very interesting, and Biziac called it representational neglect, not just simply perceptual neglect, but this was neglect in terms of the representation when it's been retrieved from memory. Perhaps more directly, though, is this rather nice experiment. I like this one quite a lot, which has shown that there might be semantic priming in these individuals in the absence of awareness. So this is the kind of study that was done. So you're sitting in front of a computer screen, and on one side an object comes up, on the other side is a scrambled nonsense image. All right? And then, soon afterwards, two items come along, and this is what we call a forced choice experiment. You're asked to say, which object did you say previously? And most of us would have no difficulty in saying it was the apple. All right? But in patients with neglect like this, patients with visual neglect, under these circumstances, these individuals were at chance at deciding whether they'd seen this object or this object previously. Remember, because they're neglecting items on the left, they really do not consciously remember that item, and in this case, it wasn't sufficient in any way to allow them to say whether they could recognize this item had been shown previously. The neat part of the study was to take it one step further. So in this case, the first screen you and I see, or the patient sees, is exactly the same. There is an object on the left-hand side, and there's a scrambled image on the other. But after that, there is a word. And our job is to decide rapidly with a button press whether that word it's a real word or it's a non-word. That's all we have to do. So there will be nonsense words or real words. Okay, so the task is very, very simple. And what is found if you and I do this is that we're much faster at responding whether this is a real word or not, depending on whether the item that had come previously is semantically related. So in this case, apple is semantically related to tree, and we'd be much faster at deciding whether tree is a word or a non-word than if, let's say, we saw a bed beforehand and then a tree. So this is, it's only a few tens of milliseconds in terms of advantage, but it shows that if there is a semantic relationship between an item you've been exposed to previously, that can speed up your decision making at this point here. And what these investigators showed was that actually that can happen in these neglect patients. So although they may be completely unaware that they've seen this apple before, that apple subconsciously has had the ability to facilitate their judgment about whether this is a word or a non-word. So there must be some sort of semantic relationship here, and it must have also got through into these brains of patients with neglect. And as I showed you before, from the functional imaging data, even though someone fails to be aware of something, we nevertheless have evidence that the brain is aware of that information. Okay, so this is an interesting thing. It's an unusual syndrome, but what about healthy people? Well, actually, one can try and do similar things, but you have to work much harder to make sure that items really go unrecognized. So unconscious priming in healthy people, you need to do something that we call masking. So here is an experiment from our own lab, which was really led by Trevor Chung and Clive Rosenthal. And when they came up with this experiment, I really thought this wasn't going to work. And I'll show you why in a minute. But surprise, surprise, it did. So this is what you have to do. We give you a list of 40 words. These are completely visible to you. You study them and you make an animacy judgment. You decide whether this is a living thing or not. All right? 40 words. And then there's a 5-minute delay, and then we're going to flash up on the screen some of the words you saw, and also we're going to throw in some novel words. And we're going to ask you whether you'd seen these words before or not. But, and here's the big catch, these words are masked. First of all, they only appear for 11 milliseconds, so 1/100th of a second, so they're very brief. But to make sure that you cannot really read these words, we mask them. So we forward and backward mask them, and masking means really scrambling the screen so that it's a bit like a snowstorm, but not quite. Scrambling the screen, so there's a scramble before the word and there's a scramble after the word, and this really makes sure that you don't know what this word is. You have no awareness what this is, and we can show that by asking you to report what was the word you saw, and people really have no idea what this word was. All right, so This is done with visible words. You encode the material with visible words, and we're going to test your memory with invisible words, if you like. And you'd think this is daft. How can you possibly do this? Well, Trevor and Clive were able to show, and I won't go into the details of what these measures mean, that actually people are able to discriminate between old words presented here, the ones you've seen before, and completely new ones, much better than by chance. So somehow, even though you cannot read these words, you are able to decide whether it's old or new, better than by chance. All right? And if we ask them a sort of subjective rating, was this old or new and how confident you are, that also mirrors that confidence. If it was old, you're much more confident than if it's new. Okay? So that's quite heroic in itself. They decided to take this one step further. And that's to do the converse. So now what they did was to get people to study 40 invisible words. So this time round, we've switched things around. So you're going to study words flashed on a screen that you can't read. All right? So you have no conscious recognition of these words or recall of these words. And you can imagine that the participants who were asked to be involved in this thought this was also daft. Because they were asked later, was this one of the words you saw before? Now this time, at retrieval, the words are visible. So this time, these words are completely visible to you, and you're simply asked, was this a word you've seen before in that list or not? But remember, at encoding, these were masked so that you have no conscious awareness of the identity of those words. And again, what they found was that people are able to do this at better than chance. So even though they're not aware of the words they saw, they can make this discrimination about whether this is a new or an old word from that list. The final bit in this heroic study, which I really didn't believe was going to work out, was when they decided to test memory for words which were invisible at encoding using words which were invisible at retrieval. Okay, so the words here are words you cannot recognize when they're presented on the screen in front of you, and the words here are also words you cannot recognize because they flash by and you have no conscious awareness of what these words are. Okay? And yet, despite that, what they found was people were able to discriminate at above chance between old and new items. So this is surprising, but maybe not so surprising if we think back in terms of what we found out about neglect patients. They were unaware of information on one side of space. Nevertheless, that information got into the brain and somehow primed them, both perceptually and semantically. And here what we're showing is a similar effect. You have to work really hard to get it. A similar effect in healthy brains, that this is possible. So these are all the sorts of behavioral studies that have suggested that priming can occur, both consciously and unconsciously, in our brains. What about the physiology? And I'm going to show you just a few examples of this kind of work. So in terms of visual stimuli, Gordon Bayliss and Ed Rolls, also in Oxford, were one of the first to show that if you record from the monkey visual system, and they were recording really from the temporal lobe here, what they found was that there were some neurons, and just to orient you here, this is time along here, this is the firing rate of a neuron, that there were some neurons which fired with a particular type of stimulus. So here's that neuron firing with that stimulus, and here's the same neuron firing with that stimulus. But if you repeated the same stimulus, what they call match trials, the firing rate of that neuron would reduce. It wasn't working in the way of a pure sensory neuron. If it was just simply responding to that stimulus, it would, without anything else, it would still be responding here. But if they used another item, then they might get firing in that neuron. And to cut a long story short, what they found was that with successive presentations, overall in this population, the neuronal discharge reduced with successive presentations. So repeated exposure to the same stimulus led to reduced firing. And if you like, an analogue of that can also be shown in humans. This is a study performed by Mick Rugg in the 1990s, and here the study is really measuring event-related potentials. These are potentials recorded over the human scalp from electrodes just placed on the scalp in this kind of system. So here's the nose this side, and this is the back of the head. And the first presentation of a stimulus might provoke the kind of activity we're seeing here. So just to orient you, these squiggles really come from the different electrodes. So this is the front of the head, this is the back of the head, right and left. And averaged over the presentation of many stimuli, what they found was that activity could be evoked by a visual stimulus being presented. But if that stimulus was represented, there was far less activity. Very similar to what I've just shown you previously with the neurons in monkey visual cortex, inferotemporal cortex. And some researchers have suggested that actually what's happening here is that there is effectively a sharpening of the representation. And by sharpening, they mean that when you first present a stimulus, many different neurons might actually be involved in responding to it. With repeated presentation, there is effectively dropout of some of the neurons which are redundant, which aren't necessary to encode that information. Only a small number might be really required to encode the properties of this umbrella after repeated exposure. Interestingly, this same kind of evidence has been shown using functional imaging, fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. And I'm just going to show you one example here for what's called repetition priming. It's turned out to be a really useful tool in many different ways. Here, again, this is from the lab of Schachter. What they found was with repeated exposure to the same stimulus, there was less activity. So these areas of activity are really showing you the areas which show repetition priming, reduction in activity with repeated exposure to the same stimulus, both in prefrontal cortex, in the front of the brain, but also posteriorly in areas in the occipital cortex and in the fusiform gyrus. This is flipping the brain so that we're now looking at the undersurface. This is the front, this is the back, this is the undersurface and the fusiform gyrus. So with first presentation, you can see quite strong activation, but with repeated exposure, there is suppression, repetition priming. Seems to be something that it's widespread with repeated presentation of the same stimulus. Now, such repetition priming has been used in many different ways. I think this is quite a nice one from my colleagues back at UCL at the beginning of the 2000s. They were trying to crack the problem about what we call object constancy. So how is it that we know that different exemplars of the same category of object, chairs, or let's say cats, really belong to that group? It's quite a difficult problem in many, many ways. What they tried to do was to examine this in a sort of physiological way by presenting either real objects or non-objects, and then looking for the areas in the brain which show this kind of repetition priming, which show reduced activity. And instead of just looking at whether objects can reduce the priming, they also showed the same objects at different sizes or from different viewpoints. So although they're the same object, they're invariant in terms of how we would say that's the same object. And they looked for those areas of the brain which didn't really mind about the size of the object on the screen or the viewpoint from which it was looked at. And what they found was that actually this blue area here, also in the fusiform gyrus, again we're showing the brain flipped over here, this blue area here is both view and size independent. It doesn't care whether you stretch the image or whether you're looking at the chair from a completely different direction. That evokes the same degree of repetition priming, it's the same degree of suppression. So presumably the neurons here are interested in qualities of the chair, regardless of the viewpoint it's being shown at or the size of that chair. It's quite interesting. And the final bit from that study was that actually for the same object category, let's say chairs, there was only really one region which was of interest. And this was, again, this left prefrontal area in the inferior frontal gyrus, which showed repetition priming across different stimuli for the same object category. Now this area has become very, very interesting to many different people because the ideas developed that this might be the area that's really interested in conceptual or semantic priming, whereas those areas we were talking about in the back of the brain might be far more interested in perceptual priming. Last thing I wanted to show you was a test of that and how neuroscience has moved to try and looking at this. So here, individuals were exposed to different kinds of stimuli, and your job here is to say whether it's a living thing or a non-living thing, an animacy judgment, as previously. And the manipulation was some of these items were repeated, whereas others were novel. So again, you can do the imaging experiment in the scanner to show which areas reduce activity with repeated exposure to the same stimulus. And interestingly, it's a similar pattern. So there are areas in the back of the brain which are more interested in visual stimuli, and there's also this area in the left prefrontal cortex, which seems to be particularly interested, which is less active when you repeat a stimulus. Now these investigators went on to use something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, which is effectively a way of disrupting brain function in healthy individuals for a short time. And they used TMS either over that left frontal area, or they used it over a control site, in this case the primary motor cortex. And what they found was that after receiving a train of these magnetic pulses over the left inferior frontal lobe, when they put those individuals into the scanner, the extent of repetition priming was really negligible. But the signal in terms of the areas in the back of the brain still continued unchanged. This didn't happen with the control stimulation. There was no effect really on the repetition suppression either in the front or the back of the brain. And interestingly, with this left frontal transcranial magnetic stimulation, what happened was there was also a change in behavior. So normally we're much faster to make those responses about whether something is live or not live if we've been exposed to it previously, and that continued in the control group, but not in those who had this transcranial magnetic stimulation to the left inferior frontal lobe, which many people wonder might be the sort of very important area in semantic priming. So let me just close. I think I've covered very, very quickly, giving you some idea about the evidence that's been used for both perceptual and conceptual priming. This has really led to the idea that actually memory systems, human memory systems, are really fractionated. The studies of amnesics have been particularly influential and helpful in this way. I think I've shown you some examples of unconscious priming that occur in individuals who have the neglect syndrome, but also in healthy people. And finally, there is some physiological evidence, both from neuronal recordings to functional imaging, fMRI, in healthy people, that there might be a physiological correlate to what we're seeing in terms of behavioural priming. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Our second speaker, Professor Ben Morgan. Ben Morgan is Associate Professor of German and Fellow at Worcester College. He has wide-ranging research interests, from medieval mysticism, Nietzsche, early psychoanalysis, Heidegger, German film, contemporary German fiction. Is that more or less cover somewhere in the summer grade, anyway. He has the linking theme, I think, is the approach that combines analysis of historical context, phenomenological philosophy, particularly early Heidegger, with recent developments in the cognitive sciences, which is what brings him to us. He's currently working on 2 projects. He's looking at an account of manuscript transmission of the late medieval mystical text, the Sister Catherine Treatise from the 1310s through to the 17th century, and also, under a working title, Fiction and Other Minds, he's engaged in an investigation in collaboration with Naomi Rokotnitz of Tel Aviv University of the way that fiction models and nurtures a complex understanding of human social interaction. And today he's going to be looking at some of the implications of research on priming for models of identity in which choice is of special importance, such as those in Kierkegaard and Heidegger, under the title Existential Choices, Priming and Models of Human Identity.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thank you very much to So-On for inviting me, and to Masud for such a stimulating talk. So I'm basically going to be trying to respond to what I've come across of some of the priming literature, and putting it on a collision course with some of the ways of thinking about individual identity and taking responsibility for your actions that one has if one's coming from the humanities. So, and I'm taking as my key example a piece of Kierkegaard, just because I think that there is, however much one calls it in question and however much different aspects of methodologies from the last 50 years have called in question ideas of individual responsibility, there's still some everyday sense in which we would like to think that we are in control of our own choices, and there's some everyday appeal of some idea of authenticity, which is in the end committed, if not to Kierkegaard, then further back to various religious ideas of living the good life. So I wanted to start with a piece of Kierkegaard about how we living in the truth is this process of living the truth for ourselves, in order to then say, could anything survive of this model if we take seriously this stuff about all the things that are happening at a subpersonal level to control our behaviour. So here's a piece of Kierkegaard at the beginning. I'm not going to be hitting you with many quotations like this, although there's a few in German from Nietzsche which I'll translate. But so I'm going to start with some demanding concentration, and then it should be easy from there on in. So Kierkegaard, in the concept of anxiety, 1844, says, on the other hand, what I'm speaking about is very plain and simple, namely, that truth is for the particular individual only as he himself produces it in action. Truth has always had many loud proclaimers, but the question is whether a person will in the deepest sense acknowledge the truth, will allow it to permeate his whole being, will accept all its consequences and not have an emergency hiding place for himself and a Judas kiss for the consequence. And so this is basically Kierkegaard responding to big-scale Hegelian models of how kind of truth is beyond us and kind of just the course of history. And he's saying, whatever may be in some sense objectively true, it's always got to be about how we establish our own relationship to that thing, or state of affairs, or moral view. And nothing is true if we haven't gone through this process of making it our truth. And in a modern neuroscientific vein, Walter J. Freeman, who was working in Berkeley and wrote the book How Brains Make Up Their Minds, also has a kind of solipsistic, individualistic take on things which he grounds in neuronal populations. Anyway, he says, every choice we make in everyday life is a way of grasping, our part of the world will cohabit, but in our terms, in accord with our unique experiences. So even from a neuroscientific point of view, there's still this idea that choices will in some sense be ours in an important individual way. So this is, as it were, my starting point. And I suppose it's there because of my sense that in the way many people live their lives, the fact that our choices are ours is important to how we structure our lives. However much a Nietzsche or a Derrida has told us this is all nonsense, right? Of course, there in the continental philosophy tradition, there has been a counter-tradition which was calling it in question, albeit in interesting ways. So this is just a little bit to say that Nietzsche got there first, and then the priming experiments came along and confirmed what Nietzsche had been saying all along. So this is a bit in, and there is actually an interesting new book on Nietzsche and cognitive neuroscience. So this is a bit of German. I'll read it up in German and translate it quickly. And it's Nietzsche basically saying that we think we will and make our own decisions, but in fact that's some sort of retrospective effect where a number of different plural souls acting below the surface make decisions and make things happen, and then some executive part of us which takes responsibility for it and feels really good because we've done this clever thing, or feels really awful because we've done this awful thing. But in a sense, it's not the thinking I that's actually taking any of these decisions. There's an underlayer. So I'll just translate it actually rather than waste time reading the German. So the person willing, making a decision, believes with a certain amount of certainty that will and action somehow belong together. So if I will something, then I control the action that results from it. And in doing this, Nietzsche says, the person willing is essentially taking over the feeling of pleasure that the parts of the personality that actually did the action have from having successfully done something. So it's taking over the kind of the upper executive part of ourselves, is taking over the pleasure of the underwills or the undersouls who actually did the work. And for Nietzsche, there's this idea that our body is just a Gesellschaftsbau viele Seelen. It's like an apartment block of lots of different souls. So he's having a kind of lots of subpersonal processes which are all just getting on with their business. And then this figure called the ego or consciousness occasionally takes responsibility for decisions which they like. And says, in a kind of parody of Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi, l'effet c'est moi. So we misguidedly take responsibility for things that we haven't, as central control, haven't done. And then he's saying what's happening here is what happens in all happy political communities is that the ruling classes take responsibility for things they haven't done but they've let the underlings do. So this is basically Nietzsche is saying that we can't trust consciousness in the conscious account of why or how we did things. There's things going on in the background, and when we happen to like what's been done, we'll take responsibility for it, and it's just kind of, as it were, it's our own ideological account of ourselves. And this will come back in the priming literature. And what then Nietzsche is asking us to do is rethink underlying assumptions and actually get rid of the very distinction between free will and unfree will, basically because he thinks that, and this is a sort of Walter Freeman point, that actually reality is just very chaotic and very messy, and the order we impose on it as to whether or not something is part of a causal chain will always depend on the perspective from which we're looking at it. So there's any number of causal stories you could tell about events, and the causality isn't just there, it depends on, as it were, the job that we want to get done or the particular facet of it we want to analyse. So he's just trying to say that causality is our conceptual tool. It's not something that's just inside the universe, because the universe is happening in so many different directions on so many levels that would be kind of to simplify issues too much. So, however, and this is the other reason for continuing having Nietzsche in the argument, is that in the same way that Kierkegaard had said, truth is because I make it my truth, and some part of me has, as it were, to consciously own things. Nietzsche comes along and says, well, consciously owning things is a load of bunkum, it's just taking responsibility for things that you can't be said to have done in any conscious way. Nevertheless, Nietzsche still thinks that there must be some sense in which we can become agents of our own life or take responsibility for our own life, and if it's not consciousness, then is it something else? And in Zarathustra he basically says, well, then maybe it's something called the body which is guiding us. So there's some sense in which what is being called the apartment block of undersouls in Beyond Good and Evil in Zarathustra, which was written just before, is already there as some different, non-conscious but nevertheless unified sense of the human body as a kind of a form of self that drives us. So he's saying tools and that understanding and spirit are tools and toys. So it's all part of his critique of the conscious self-unconscious understanding. Understanding and spirit are tools and toys. Behind them is something that Nietzsche was calling the self. So here he's trying to use the word self to get away from conscious self-understanding, and it might be there in its kind of a usage of self that Jung will take over too. The self also looks with the eyes of the senses. It also listens with the ears of the spirit. The self is always listening and looking. It compares and forces and conquers and destroys. It dominates and is also the dominator of the ego. Behind your thoughts and feelings, my brother, stands a very powerful ordering figure, an unknown wise man called the self. in your body is where this self lives. Your body is this self, or this order giver. So, what I want to set up is the Kierkegaardian hope that we can consciously reappropriate our lives, Nietzsche's critique, but having done his critique, he nevertheless wants some sense that we control our lives. But in his idea, it's an appeal to the body. It's also interesting, and you would have noticed from this, my translation maybe, that Nietzsche's idiom is odd. Thus spoke Zarathustra is a parody of Luther's German translation of the Bible. And so when Nietzsche is trying to work out where we go next once we've called in question a number of our views about selfhood, when he's looking for a vocabulary that could replace naive self-understanding or a naive emphasis on consciousness, he looks interestingly to religious vocabularies which he part parodies and parts exploits to explain this, to appeal to or to reference the sorts of social practices that maybe historically have been places where people didn't rely too much on consciousness. So when we're one kind of strand of my argument, which I won't necessarily follow through, but I wanted to throw into the room, is that if we're taking on board the sort of priming story about how we are not consciously in control of everything we do, but we're looking at ways of dealing with this problem or retaining responsibility, then some sense of the places that historically, or the sorts of practices historically we have developed for living a life that isn't consciousness-centered may sometimes be useful, or maybe places we can return to kind of work out what's left of responsibility if some naive idea of the conscious choice is thrown out of the window. So there's some sense in which religious practices may be a thing to look at, amongst others. And the other thing I wanted to make sure is that if we're going to do some critique of the Kierkegaardian idea of consciously owning our choices, that we have to keep as our argument some understanding that responsibility is something that human beings do. That very often the argument goes, well, we thought that responsibility meant owning consciously my choices. I can't own consciously my choices, therefore responsibility doesn't exist. And that just seems to be wrong. That responsibility is a social practice. It is something we recognise people around us who we think are responsible. So therefore we must get used to just describing what we call responsibility and trying to understand how that works. So it may just be that we had a naive account of what that was, namely some super conscious, self-transparent way of relating to our actions. It's obviously not that, but I think we have to acknowledge that taking responsibility is something that human beings already do. We just have to try to connect our humanities understandings and the neuroscience that helps us explain it. So basically I'm encouraging us to try and look at, again, at the sort of cultural practices that being responsible depends on. And this is a sort of ordinary language argument. It's essentially saying, if we look at how we talk about responsibility, where we go to find examples of responsible behaviour, then we might find ways of helping us rethink, once we've given up this rather naive view that being responsible means being self-transparent and being entirely in control of my choices. And so, just because I like it, this is an appeal to Austin's plea for excuses, which, as the title suggests, is again, it's a reflection on versions of responsibility and how we think about how we can be agents of our own actions. So what I've done so far is I've set up the Kierkegaardian kind of gold standard of completely consciously owning your own truth. It's probably unfair on Kierkegaard, but for the moment. I said that, well, that's already been questioned, but even in the Nietzschean tradition, the question comes, still wants some sense of how we can nevertheless be agents of our own lives. And I'm saying that when we do that, we've got to have we shouldn't just, because a very narrow version of consciously owning your decisions gets thrown out of the window, we shouldn't simply, then give up on the idea of responsibility altogether, but take a sort of historical view to the ways in which so far human beings have managed responsibility for themselves. So what I'm trying to do, and this is, as it were, work in progress, so I'm not going to give lots of finished answers. I'm trying to give a model of making and owning decisions which draws on neuroscientific and social psychological literature, so that whatever version of kind of post-Kierkegaardian responsibility we have, it has to be compatible with a naturalist account of how the brain seems to make decisions. I think when we're looking at how these accounts are derived in experiments, I think we have to have a properly Darwinian, ecological account of where a decision happens. And essentially later on I'm going to be saying the group that I'm particularly, whose work I've been following a bit, that they just don't do quite enough of putting human beings in niches with other people. There's not enough of kind of putting the brain in a wider ecology when they're thinking about their experiments, and that seems to be, and that means that you then get some false senses of how decisions are always going to be made on your own and that sort of stuff. So there's essentially, and sometimes I say, well, the problem is they haven't read Heidegger well enough, but that argument isn't going to really play with people. So this tells us they haven't read Darwin well enough, because if you go back, Darwin is all about things being connected and in a niche. So. And finally, when we're kind of developing our naturalistically informed account of decision making, and we've been properly phenomenological, archaeological, or Darwinian, just to make sure that we're not leaving behind everyday practices of taking responsibility, but realise that what we're trying to make sense of is the things that we already recognise as taking responsibility, and we don't have to suddenly call it all in question, because we've got hundreds of years of people knowing what it means to be responsible. So, what I'm going to be drawing on a bit is one of these super useful arguments in target articles in behavioural and brain sciences, where you get someone makes a statement, and then all the people who are the great and good at that field come and reply to it, and therefore you kind of get a sense of what's going on at the moment. I'd already been following the work of John Barr at Yale on priming, and then last year he and Julie Wang published this thing where they try and put some of their priming stuff together in order to come up with a theory of human nature, essentially a theory of the human personality, under the title of The Selfish Goal, Autonomously Operating Motivational Structures as the Proximate Cause of Human Judgment and Behaviour. And Barr's background, he's been doing this sort of work since the 1990s, and it's social psychological research into priming and automaticity. And they're very interested in the way, his group and is very interested in the way in which behaviour is driven by situational cues operating below the threshold of consciousness. And it's kind of the things that Masad was talking about, where you show people words and it affects their behaviour. Like you show them the word bingo and they walk more slowly, or you show them the word rude and then they have an argument with the person they happen to meet in the corridor, and this sort of thing. The questions that then Huang and Barr are addressing in this new article are as follows. The environment is a rich source of multiple, oftentimes simultaneous cues, many of which are linked to different, often competing behavioural impulses. How are these parallel environmental influences funneled into the necessarily serial behaviour of a single individual? So they've noticed the way in which we behave because the situation makes us behave in that way. And the situation may be trying to make us behave in a number of different ways. And how do we reconcile the different prompts that we're not even aware of, that are kind of forcing subpersonal processes to kick into action and make us be rude or be old all at the same time? So they then ask, what then are the characteristics of an evolutionarily ancient system that could integrate multiple, sometimes competing influences into overt behaviour expressed at the level of the individual organism, particularly in the absence of overarching conscious processing to integrate and prioritise these goals? So they're basically saying that this sort of situationally prompted behaviour predates consciousness. It's something that other mammals will share, or other forms of life will share. And however this sort of conflict in overdetermined situations is managed, it can't just be by consciousness, otherwise all other animals will be failing to be able to kind of to manage their lives in even marginally coherent ways. And it's also telling a story that is makes evolutionary sense. That there must be ways in which below the threshold of consciousness, before consciousness, these sorts of problems are being managed. And then those are the questions asked by Huang and Barr, and then obviously this is also something asked by some of the peer responses in the target article. Why is it that we have to do one thing at a time? It seems to be that whatever happens, we're going to have some sense that human behaviour is, in lots of cases, we're multitasking. And sometimes I have to choose between talking to my mum on Skype and feeding the kids, but I might be able to do both at the same time. And there are lots of situations in which we don't necessarily, this kind of idea of serial behaviour and one body only doing one thing just seems to be pushing things in directions which aren't helpful. Anyway, what the article then draws together is lots of ways in which we are constantly doing, at a level we're not aware of, things that make sense. So there's kind of intentional behaviour which we do not consciously intend, and lots of our interaction with other people and with our environment is driven by these forms of purposive but nevertheless unconscious behaviour. And to describe this, Ba and Huang use the term goal, which is some sense of kind of some primed, sensible response to something that's happened. So intentional behaviour is honed by evolution, prompted by cues in the situation we're currently negotiating, and for which we don't need, in the same way that Massa's research is saying, we respond to something and have no idea that we've been primed. The situation primed us to act in a particular way, the evolutionary honed behaviour kicks in, and we're not aware that we're doing it. So it's important that we do not need consciousness for these things to happen. And then one of the things that Huang and Ba, I think that they're adding to the discussion is basically borrowing from the metaphor of the selfish gene. They come up with this idea of the selfish goal, which basically means that once a goal has kicked in, it just wants to find, or once a form of behaviour, which they're calling a goal, has kicked in, then it is just interested in that piece of behaviour being followed through, regardless of whether it's in the long-term interests of the individual or whatever else must. And so you're going to have a number of, as it were, our behaviour will be driven by these responses kicking in, and then just trying to push through to the end and competing with each other to be the form of behaviour that dominates what we're doing at any particular moment. So this is very much like Nietzsche's apartment block of undersouls, or of these kind of underlings doing things in the background of which the rulers are not, if there is such a thing, not without the rulers knowing. So in this Huang and Ba account, goals, or as in forms of primed behaviour, are competing with other goals currently operating for dominance. And this is a version, as it were, one level of down of what we already know from Dan Dennett's account of the Joycean machine of consciousness. So for Dennett's model of consciousness, there's various threads of what we're paying attention to or dealing with at any one moment, which are kind of competing to be the salient thing that we really are consciously reflecting on. And in the Ba-Huang model, this is actually happening a layer down. There's a number of goals that are competing to, or a number of forms of behaviour that are competing to dominate the things that we'll actually be doing. And one of them is likely in their account to dominate. Although, again, as the responses to the Target article pointed out, maybe there'll be kind of compromises where, in fact, they won't actually have to be this sort of fighting it to the death that they sometimes suggest. So this seems to be useful because of the way it challenges a number of familiar assumptions. So one of the things is that unconscious goal conflict resolution is possible. So that it's just more information about the way lots and lots of intelligent work and adaptive work goes on in the background that we don't need to know stuff about. So probably. And it even means that things that were previously associated very much with our conscious endeavours can happen without our knowing it. Namely, we can be primed to exercise more self-control in ways that we don't necessarily know or aren't aware of. If it's a context which is knowing, if we've been helped to prime to not have that piece of cake or whatever, then we can, without even being aware that we're exercising dietary self-control, this goal can come to dominate. And even when we're pursuing conscious goals, we won't necessarily know how much that's affecting how we interact with the environment. Because one of the things about a goal, as Ba and Huang described it, which in fact fits interestingly with kind of Heideggerian phenomenology, is that the thing that we're currently doing, or so that we are, will affect how the world appears to us. So the world is disclosed through the tasks that we're currently interested in. So obviously I notice red traffic lights more in the car than when I'm on the sidewalk, as a simple example. I don't react to the red of a red traffic light when I'm on the sidewalk in a way that I would if I'm driving, actually. And then another thing that Ba and Huang want to say is that this model of goals kind of operating in the background with us without our conscious processing means that working memory is also something which must be there, available in the background. We don't have to think of working memory as something which is necessarily conscious. And this is an article that an argument that people have been making since the early 2000s. So that's a quick kind of summary of the sorts of things that. So Barr and Huang are doing a sort of survey article of the ways in which their and other research on priming might feed into a remodeling of how we think about decisions. So I'm just kind of doing a kind of meta summary of someone's meta summary. Well, the point is then to bring us back to thinking about this more familiar model of how in the humanities people might want to think about taking responsibility for their actions. Huang and Barr are basically making the point that we don't drive our own behaviour. And this is kind of being, it must be pretty clear now after an hour and a half of this that we don't drive our own behaviour. Our central claim here is that an individual comprises multiple goals, each of which exerts a selfish influence on how that person sees the world and behaves in it, guiding judgments and behaviour in the service of the current goal, but not necessarily in the service of the individual's actual overall best interests. So that's the first thing that they're saying. So when we're thinking about taking responsibility in the Kierkegaardian way and having truth for us, then who or what is it that will be taking the truth for who? If we've if we've fragmented into this apartment block of different undersouls, and we've given up the idea that there's a super soul who's kind of ruling them all, then who or what will be taking responsibility? And then the important point is that, which makes the things all doubly difficult, is not only are we a fragmentary agglomeration of evolutionary honed forms of behaviour, but we're very good at telling ourselves fibs about why we did things. So confabulation and self-deception mean that the first person view of our own behaviour is in no way a privileged one. So because of confabulation and self-deception, we don't understand what drives our behaviour, and evolution doesn't particularly care that we don't understand. It's sometimes actually of a benefit to not know why we've done something. It makes us better liars when we're selling ourselves to our peers, because we don't think we've been selfish when we have, and so we can convince our peers that we're not selfish. So to the extent that human judgment and behaviour were driven by goal processes before the central self even evolved, many instances of self-deception can be seen as a result of the autonomous nature of all goal pursuits. So we started with Kierkegaard taking responsibility for our own behaviour, owning our own truth. Now we've ended up with a situation where, if we look at the sort of priming literature, we've split into, it's not just memory that's fractionalised. All our activity is now being driven by quasi-autonomous forms of kind of routines. And our ability to round on this and kind of get ourselves in order is also being questioned because we're so good at giving the wrong reasons for why we did things. Before I then kind of take the final plunge and kind of connect the different bits of the argument, some of the in fact, in order to help myself save responsibility from the plurality of the primary literature, some possible problems with the Barr-Huang model. So I'm not sure that you necessarily need the word goals as opposed to some basically doing things for reasons. It seems to be too end-driven, something about which I don't understand why that necessarily has to be the case. And obviously the question of selfish routines and responses seems, I don't know if that's the most useful term, or it's been inspired by reading some Dawkins and that's what it's there, but it basically just means forms of behaviour that have their own autonomy and momentum. And there's no reason why they couldn't be connected to what I'm calling visceral forms of togetherness, so sex, touch, empathy, other forms of emotional contagion. There's no reason why we couldn't be primed to do something which was precisely about our embeddedness in the social world of human interaction. So, yes to the kind of the momentum of these routines and their subpersonal operation, but I don't know why we have to call that selfish, although it seems to be misleading and it stops us being able to get out of the problems that this approach throws up. So as well as getting rid of the idea that selfish is the only way of talking about the goals, then as I warned, I think that we basically need to get beyond the isolated brain subject model, because our organism is always in a niche, and you have to think the niche always in terms of when you're thinking about what the brain does. And then just a bit of the origin of species to remind us of this embeddedness of any particular creature in a set of relationships with other creatures and also in a world and also with other conspecifics. The structure of every organic being is related in the most essential yet often hidden matter to that of all other organic beings with which it comes into competition for food or residence, and from which it has to escape or on which it preys. So we're always part of a wider network, which in phenomenological terms we would call being in the world with others. Okay, so we started with Kierkegaard's subject on his or her own. It was very much his own in Kierkegaard's language, but we'd say on his or her own, taking over his truth for himself. Nietzsche tried to burn us that apart, but still wanted a version of responsibility. But the primary literature seems to confirm a sort of Nietzschean view of us being a multiplicity of different impulses that aren't necessarily controlled. The idea that our own ability consciously to inhibit behaviours would be the way out of this problem doesn't work, because it's not clear that our conscious account of what we're doing is going to be reliable. So, that critique of what drives our behaviour is premised on this kind of isolated, selfish. It's a kind of Cartesian subject has slipped in and is still informing the brain science. And so I'm basically saying, well, if we try and put visceral togetherness in, put some sort of being in an ecological niche into our argument more, will that help us get beyond the apparent impasse that we might want in an everyday life, a version of responsibility of the Kierkegaardian sort, but the science is telling us no way. So, Huang and Simon challenged the idea of individuals owning their behaviour. But essentially, I think if we put ourselves back in a world, we can see a way beyond it. So, our behaviour is driven by situational cues. This is the problem. We might inhibit cues, but conflicts between goals don't need us to be there to be doing the inhibiting, and the story we tell won't be accurate. It might be some sort of confabulation. Okay, so this is just summarising where we've got. So, how could truth or authenticity work then? And I think the basic thing you have to make is very simply that truth is something we do with other people. And that will solve all our problems. And essentially there's social psychological literature on the ways in which we may confabulate about our own behaviour, but we are in many ways interestingly reliable about other people's behaviours and other people's self-understanding. And often the ways my blindness and your insight into what I'm not very good at will kind of interestingly correlate to one another. So essentially, if we don't have our individual on his or her own trying to own the truth, but we have a group of people who know each other well, helping each other to own the truth together, then we're going to get further. And what's more, we're not going to have to reinvent the wheel, because then we're going to look at cultural resources for how groups of people help themselves get a sense of control of their own life. But what we have lost is this heroic image of the Kierkegaardian or Heideggerian individual who rounds on their own life all on their own. And so this is basically, I've just alighted on some work by Baziria and Carlson, but there's quite a lot of the literature which is basically about the ways in which other people know more about us than we know about ourselves, which can be then, as it were, the counteract the sense that because the primary literature tells us we never know what we're doing, we're just doing it anyway. So Baziria and Carlson write, we are astute judges of each other's personalities, likely due to the importance of interpersonal perception for our social species. So there's an evolutionary pressure, not just to react quickly to situations, but also to be able to read other people and be able to not necessarily read ourselves. As a result, other people, especially those who spend a lot of time around us and who we are open to, almost inevitably become experts on our personality. And therefore, in order to kind of get beyond the first-person privilege in a reliable way, you need some sort of interaction of self and other ratings of views of what we do. So we need both self and other ratings of a person's personality do not simply provide redundant information, instead they capture different aspects. And so then essentially what we end up encouraging is some versions of kind of practices of sincerity, where it turns out also that whilst we're not very good at explaining our own behaviour, if we conduct a thought experiment where we say, what would someone else say about this, we're actually, or what was someone else's impression, of us. We're quite good at registering other people's impressions. So in fact, there are ways in which people will be encouraged to, as it were, do this sort of metacognition where they feed into some sort of skepticism of their own views. It seems that we have some awareness of how others see us. We do not always make use of this information when judging our own personality. So basically what I hope I've encouraged us to do is, so we take seriously this Protestant sense that we can become authors of our own lives. And Nietzsche, even in his critique of it, is still Protestant enough to think that he wants to do it, and indeed it's in lots of cultural traditions that we want to be there and take responsibility for our life on the day of reckoning. The kind of priming literature, in interesting ways, blows apart what it might mean to take responsibility, because so much is happening at a level that we don't control. However, I think that if we feed into this primary literature's more sense of how human beings are doing things together, then these confabulation and self-deception problems, which used to be there when we're left on our own to try and make sense of our behaviour, can disappear. And essentially what this is then trying to do is show how an ecological and or phenomenological reading of the basic starting point, namely of people embedded in a world with others, can encourage us, can kind of show directions that we might take the debates that are inquiring about other people are provoking with their insistence, rightful insistence that we take the priming insights seriously. Thank you very much indeed.
You will not